concepts that we see elsewhere in South Africa, right of admission reserved. They're often used quite arbitrarily to exclude people on the basis of class, on the basis of race, on the basis of geography, on the basis of education, on the basis simply of we don't like you. And, you know, those right of admission reserved signs, to me, are slightly at odds with contemporary South Africa's desires and needs and what we're required to have in order to undo the weird spatial dynamics and very strange divisions. So in barring the media, I think the EFF kind of overshot the mark and also shot itself in the foot, if I can mix metaphors in that way. I think the right to freedom of expression is only going to work if you defend the right of people that you oppose and who have opposing views to your own to be able to speak out. So for me, I'm not interested in censoring people. There are people who disagree with me violently. There are political parties across the spectrum from whom I have nothing but huge ideological distinctions. But I have to value the right that they should be able to put their views across. So in South Africa, even a party like the Freedom Front Plus, even parties on the other end of the spectrum have the right to canvass for votes and have the right to have their views reported on fairly, as does the economic freedom fighters. There are mechanisms and structures in place in South Africa that when an organization feels unhappy with the coverage that it is getting from a particular media house, it can go to the Press Ombud, it can go to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa, and parties have done this. Should they feel no satisfaction in that route, they can go the way of the court system with libel suits, because unfortunately in South Africa, libel is still a criminal offence. And so I suspect that the EFF may have to do deep introspection around the way in which it engages with South Africa's media. This is not about whether the media are responsible. This is not about whether they say the things that we like or whether they're truthful or not. If they're not truthful, there are mechanisms in place by which we can take them on. It is the duty of organizations in a political atmosphere like South Africa to not further polarize the political space, because the short-term gains, the popular support of those who are your supporters, may have long-term consequences for the society that we live in, where we have greater intolerance for people who have political differences from us. If those differences are not threatening to the health of our society or our individual rights to life, I suspect we need to begin to learn, and this is part of the political education that this party and other parties keep talking about, that needs to be instilled not just in its members, but in the ethos of how the organization responds.
Angelo, let's just look at another issue. In all honesty, in all frankness, do you think that the media is actually divided? Is there some sort of divide within the media industry? Because just personally speaking, coming from ANN7, I used to work for ANN7 before, and of course we were victimized, not only by the EFF, but I mean, you have government officials. I mean, I remember I cried in a press briefing, and a government official was actually behind that, and I don't remember. All I remember was Barry Bateman, and I think an international journalist actually standing up for me. And I mean, the rest of the journalists in that press briefing just looked at me. And I remember vividly also, I think the first time I met you was actually at a press briefing. I think there was a roundtable discussion, and this was in Centurion. You were still at ENC at that time, and I was this young journalist from ANN7, even scared to say, listen, I'm from ANN7. I remember we were actually dishing up salads, and you came to me and you're like, listen, you're an employee. Keep your head up. Okay, this is just temporary, and you probably will move on further from that. And I actually kept those words, but I don't remember people, rallying in our corner, Angelo. I remember a statement from SANEF, but I don't remember what we are seeing right now.
So I was a little afraid of where that story was going when you started implicating me. I thought, oh dear, what have I done? But I think it is important for us to draw distinctions between media freedom and freedom of expression. They are linked, but they're not the same thing. I think people have the freedom to express their own beliefs, ideas, and freedom of association. I think a pillar of a democratic society is a free press. Now, in South Africa, that freedom of the media is to write the things they do. There are mechanisms in place. I think the culture of bullying that we see in South Africa is part of the larger problem of a culture of violence and violation that we see in this country. That people who are seen to be lesser or have less power are often treated very, very badly, whether it is top-down violence inside communities, between men and women, between older and younger people. In the case of journalists, there's often a conflation of the individual journalists who work for a living with a kind of agenda by the corporate owners of that media. And here again in South Africa, we need to draw distinctions between the public media, public broadcaster, and privately owned media or corporate owned media. And so the public broadcaster has been through some severely testing times where it was used as a state broadcaster. I think we're in the process of trying to rebuild the public broadcaster, and that is a process that is going to take time. The corporate media, I think, have a certain kind of charter that they adhere to, but we should never forget that just as we should be wary of the state controlling the public broadcaster and making it a state broadcaster, we should have concerns and questions around the way in which the corporate owners of corporate media have the ability to influence the way in which that happens. Now, this is not a blanket statement. When we begin to investigate that, we must be clear to investigate the political economy of individual media houses, who owns them, then go into the nitty-gritty of the structures of accountability, look at their editorial policies, and begin to ask questions by investigation. So if political parties object to how a particular media house conducts itself, the mechanisms are in place. When other people are interested in critiquing the media, it is important to do an analysis of ownership, to distinguish and not simply say the media, because that does not exist in South Africa. Conspiracy theories that imagine that media houses get together and collude is also silly, because these are competitors in a capitalist market system. And lastly, I think it is important for people to begin to value that you don't just want to hear journalists who tell you stories that confirm your existing worldview. Sometimes journalists are going to get it wrong, and they must learn from those experiences and be held to account. And there are professional structures by which that can be done. But the vilification and bullying of individual journalists is, for me, there's a line that cannot be crossed. I can disagree vehemently with somebody. I can find them personally deeply contemptible, but I will defend their right to do the work that they do, and hold them accountable for misrepresentations, for lies, for misunderstandings in the structures that exist. But I think we have a culture of bullying in South Africa, of which the treatment of journalists often becomes merely one example. We see this in other places, and often the people who do the bullying will then claim the status of having been bullied. And I'm sorry, but if you're an elected official or a senior official in a political party, you do not have the right to claim to be bullied. You have a great sense of responsibility, but you also have major resources available to you that a 20-year-old, 25-year-old, 30-year-old journalist who's simply doing work isn't able to have. And if you disagree with them, you can sit down with their editors and object to what it is that's being done. Should you still have no happiness, organizations and individuals can go to the complaints officers, and if you're still not unhappy, political parties certainly have the financial means and connections and networks to sue media houses where they feel unhappy. And this has happened before. And not just for the EFF, for all political parties. And I think here is a sobering moment for all of South Africans to sit back and not just go, this is an EFF problem. This is a South African problem. The way in which we treat people needs to change. Bullying is unacceptable. And to bully journalists because you have a kind of agenda against, and it may be a legitimate one, the media house for which they work, because that media house is part of a corporate structure that you think is part of a problem that your political party wants to address, that is unacceptable. And there I think all political parties need to begin to do the political education with not just their supporters but all of their officials.
Okay, the second last question coming from my side. Are you of the view, do you agree with Julius Malema when he says that South African media is in denial, that South African media is actually captured?
I wouldn't use the phrase captured. What I would do is, in looking at the political economy of South Africa's corporate media, and in looking at the political economy that's changing for South Africa's public media, the public broadcaster, there are certainly elements that could be done much better. The ways in which, for example, they're run for profit in the corporate sector means that it is shareholders who have demands to deliver viewers. And the delivery of viewers is related to the delivery of advertising revenue, and the advertising revenue is often deeply structured in with the corporate interests of the holding company. Often also the holding company may have various contracts with various government entities. Spectrum allocation, digital migration are all elements of this. And so when we're looking at this, we need to be aware that these are not just people who are interested in telling us the story of the world. They're also subsidiaries of corporations that wish to profit for its shareholders. And there, the editorial policies that separate the business interest from the journalistic interest, that must be held sacrosanct. And there it is important for viewers, for ordinary people, for political organizations, for all organizations to begin to investigate that political economy. In the public broadcaster, the ability of politicians to sway and influence the role of the public broadcaster to educate, inform and entertain, that needs to be ended, because that era of using the public broadcaster as a mouthpiece for government has to end. And government officials across all three tiers and all three spheres have to realize that if they find that the public broadcaster does something that they find unfair, they should go to the necessary complaints process. No phone calls should be made to people to instruct them to do certain things. But this, of course, is compromised by cadre deployment. So Mamphele Ramphele, as well as Njabulo Ndebele, have for a long time now, for almost 15 to 20 years, critiqued the consequences of cadre deployment out of the governing party. Because while its intentions are good, if those governing party officials do not actually do the work, and in this country we've had an example where digital migration was the official policy of the party, the official policy of government, but the deployed individual in the office of the Ministry of Communication decided that that was not what she was going to do. That, I think, is part of the problem. And Njabulo Ndebele, again, I don't wish to harp on him, but he's a major senior intellectual in this country from whom we can still learn so much, already pointed out in his columns collected in Fine Lines from the Box that it's useless to start talking about individuals who are corrupt. We need to start investigating, asking ourselves questions about the condition of corruptibility, why it is that people are open to being corrupted, and that will answer tougher questions that may allow us to change the way in which we behave. So bullying needs to go, and the way in which we imagine the news broadcasters are simply blank platforms. Some of them are subsidiaries of corporates that have interests in making money out of government or sectors of government or sectors of factions of particular political organizations. And the public broadcaster's duty is to keep us all informed, educated and entertained, and its duty is a constitutionally mandated duty that is a fundamental right in the Constitution that all 58 million of us have to reliable, good information, and therefore dismissing the public broadcaster is, I think, very, very dangerous for a democratizing South Africa. Many people think of South Africa as democratic. I think of it as democratizing. We've had 25 years with some leaps forward and back. It's time for us to continue on the democratizing route, and some of that means unlearning those habits of bullying, castigating and barring people because we don't agree with them.
Just in conclusion, I heard Ralph Matsecha earlier on radio on SAFM saying that a round table is needed between political parties, between SANEF, between the barred media houses, and possibly some more. I mean, would you think that actually this would somewhat pave the way moving forward?
So that may be one step, because South Africans have a great belief in conflict resolution. I think that's one step, but habits of being and habits of thinking have to change. Political parties have to stop believing that their version of the world is the version that we should all promulgate and believe in. Secondly, they have to accept that part of the nature of living in a democratic society is to have some of your opinions criticized by journalists and investigated. Media houses and journalists themselves have to take greater responsibility to actually report fairly and, in order to keep the freely of their reportage going. And we, I think, have too often overlooked some of the errors as mere glitches when they are really symptoms of systemic problems, that the relationships between political parties and, media houses is at the level of paper and the level of speech supposedly free and fair, but in practice it often has to do with nice relations with the governing party, nice relations with large organizations, which explains why certain stories are never broken, which explains why there is a focus on a certain kind of politics and an ignoring of the fact of the inequality that is the pockmark of this society, that it took an international organization, media organization, to remark upon the vast inequality for that inequality to become an issue that South African media houses started focusing on. And where is that reportage now? So often the corporate interests in privately owned media drives the news agenda, and it's visible to anybody who does the analysis. And in the public media, it is often the bullying by government officials and by political party officials against people who are trying to do their jobs. And journalists are flawed. Organizations in the media are flawed, but we cannot have a situation where we pretend that all of this is happening as it is on paper, when in reality there is interference at almost every level against individual journalists who are telling their stories on Twitter as we speak.
Well, thank you so much. Quite a lot to actually swallow, but it's always a pleasure picking on your brain. Of course, that was the director of research at ASRI, Angelo Fick. Of course, we're actually getting ready for the much anticipated press briefing that will happen at 12 o'clock. We can see journalists starting to trickle in, but of course, I see, we've got a little monitor here in our studio. Some EFF delegates are still actually, in discussions there in plenary. But of course, at 12 o'clock, there is that briefing with the new elected leadership of the EFF. But as for me, Natasha Piri, let's just leave it here now. And of course, we will catch up with you later with, of course, Angelo Fick to actually unpack more of this conference. Of course, after lunch, EFF delegates will be going to commissions. Of course, that's a closed session. And of course, as SABC, we will give you all the latest updates and developments in regards to today's election of the CCT members as well.
Thanks so much, Natasha, crossing to us from Nasrec, giving us insightful analysis there with Angelo Fick. It's time for a short break. We'll have more news for you.